The flower shop on Hawthorne Street had never been famous, yet everyone in the neighborhood knew it. The little storefront stood between an old bookstore and a bakery that filled the morning air with the scent of warm bread. Every weekday at exactly 8 o'clock, Amy White unlocked the faded green door, watered the flowers lined outside, switched the small wooden sign from closed to open, and waited for the day's customers. She loved the predictability of flowers. Roses apologized. Lilies comforted. Sunflowers celebrated. Orchids impressed. Every bouquet carried emotions that people often struggle to express themselves. Amy believed flowers rarely lied, even when people did. She had spent 12 years arranging blooms for birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, graduations, and funerals. In all that time, she thought she had seen every unusual request imaginable. She was wrong. The morning that changed everything began quietly enough. Rain tapped softly against the windows while jazz music drifted from the old radio near the register. Around noon, business slowed. Amy organized fresh tulips while her assistant Richard updated inventory in the back room. The bell above the entrance chimed once. A man entered wearing a charcoal gray coat despite the mild weather. He appeared to be somewhere in his 60s, though his posture made him seem younger. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he carried no umbrella even though the sidewalks outside glistened with rain. What Amy noticed first was not his appearance but his silence. He spent nearly 5 minutes walking around the shop without touching a single flower. Instead, he looked at every arrangement as if searching for something invisible hidden among the petals. Finally, he approached the counter and placed a small cream-colored envelope on the polished wood. "I would like you to prepare exactly what is described inside," he said calmly. His voice was gentle, almost too gentle. Amy smiled politely and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper. There was no greeting. No signature. Only a list written in elegant handwriting. 7 white roses. 4 blue irises. 3 sprigs of rosemary. 1 sunflower facing west. No ribbon. No wrapping paper. Delivery exactly 30 days from today at precisely 4:17 p.m., recipient unknown until the morning of delivery. Payment enclosed. Amy looked back into the envelope. There was indeed cash. Far more than the arrangement would cost. "I'm sorry," she said. "You forgot to include the recipient's name and address." "No," the man replied. "Those details will arrive later." Amy frowned. "How?" "You'll receive another envelope." Richard glanced toward the counter, sensing the unusual conversation but saying nothing. Amy continued reading. Near the bottom of the page was one final instruction. "If any flower becomes unavailable, cancel the order entirely." She had handled demanding clients before, but this felt different. "May I ask what the occasion is?" she asked. The man smiled with an expression that seemed equal parts kindness and sadness. "No occasion," he answered. "Only timing." Before Amy could ask another question, he thanked her, turned around, and walked out into the rain. She hurried to the window, expecting to see him crossing the street. Instead, the sidewalk outside was empty. There was no car pulling away. No figure disappearing around the corner. Only rain falling steadily onto the pavement. Richard approached the counter. Where did he go? Amy kept staring through the glass. That's exactly what I was wondering. She looked down once more at the handwritten order. Something about it unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the strange delivery instructions. Perhaps it was the unusually precise time. Or perhaps it was the uncomfortable feeling that the mysterious customer hadn't been placing an order for flowers at all. He had been setting something else in motion. The unusual order became the quiet center of Amy's thoughts during the following weeks. She completed wedding arrangements, sympathy bouquets, birthday baskets, and corporate deliveries with her usual care, yet every evening before locking the shop she opened the drawer containing the cream-colored envelope and read the instructions once more. Nothing about the order made practical sense. Fresh flowers could not simply wait for a month, especially not a sunflower that had to be facing west, as though the direction itself mattered as much as the flower. Richard joked that perhaps they were serving a secret society whose members communicated through bouquets instead of letters, but even he admitted the customer had seemed strangely unforgettable. Neither of them had ever seen him before, and despite asking several neighboring shop owners, no one remembered an older gentleman in a charcoal gray coat visiting Hawthorne Street that rainy afternoon. Amy considered canceling the order more than once. The money alone was enough to cover any inconvenience, yet something prevented her from returning it to the empty envelope. It was as though abandoning the request would leave an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. 29 days passed without another sign of the mysterious customer. Then, just after opening the shop on the morning of the 30th day, the bell above the entrance rang. Amy looked up, expecting a customer carrying birthday balloons or searching for anniversary roses. Instead, no one stood in the doorway. The street outside was almost empty except for a cyclist riding past and an elderly woman walking a small white dog. Confused, Amy stepped outside. Resting neatly against the threshold was another cream-colored envelope. It looked identical to the first one. There were no stamps, no address, no footprints nearby despite the light layer of dust left by road construction earlier that morning. She picked it up and hurried back inside. Richard watched silently as she opened it with a letter opener. Inside was a single page. Recipient, Eleanor Brooks. Address, 17, Ashwood Lane. Deliver personally at exactly 4:17 p.m. Do not arrive early. Do not arrive late. The bouquet must be handed directly to her. If another person answers the door, wait until she appears. Do not leave the flowers unattended under any circumstance. Beneath the instructions was one final sentence that made Amy's heartbeat quicken. She will say she did not order flowers. Tell her they were ordered exactly 30 days ago. Say nothing else. Richard leaned closer after reading the note. This is getting creepy. Amy nodded without taking her eyes off the page. Have you ever heard of Eleanor Brooks? Richard searched the shop's customer records on the computer. Nothing. No previous orders. No deliveries. No phone number. No email address. Amy searched social media during her lunch break but found dozens of women sharing the same name and none living anywhere near Ashwood Lane. Curiosity slowly replaced uneasiness. She drove past the address shortly after 2 o'clock, well before the delivery time, simply to make sure the location existed. It did. The house stood at the end of a peaceful street lined with maple trees. It was small but carefully maintained, with white shutters, climbing roses around the porch, and a blue mailbox polished until it reflected the afternoon sunlight. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the roof, producing soft notes that carried into the quiet neighborhood. Nothing appeared unusual. No moving trucks. No party decorations. No signs suggesting a celebration or memorial. Amy deliberately did not approach the front door. The instructions had been unusually specific about timing, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt reluctant to ignore them. She returned to the flower shop and began assembling the bouquet exactly as described. 7 white roses. 4 blue irises. 3 fragrant sprigs of rosemary. Finally, after searching through dozens of sunflowers, she found one whose bloom naturally leaned toward the west when placed upright in the vase. Richard laughed nervously at the coincidence, but Amy said nothing. At precisely 4 o'clock she placed the finished bouquet in the delivery van and began the short drive toward Ashwood Lane. The digital clock on the dashboard changed minute by minute while an odd silence filled the vehicle. She arrived at the end of the street with 6 minutes to spare and parked around the corner, unwilling to be early. At exactly 4:16 she stepped onto the pathway carrying the bouquet with both hands. 1 minute later, as the clock on her phone turned to 4:17, she reached the front door and gently pressed the doorbell. Almost immediately, footsteps echoed from inside the house. The door opened almost at once, revealing a woman in her early 70s with neatly pinned silver hair and bright hazel eyes that still carried the alertness of someone much younger. She wore a light blue cardigan over a cream-colored dress, and flour dust covered one sleeve, suggesting she had been baking when the bell rang. The warm aroma of cinnamon drifted through the doorway. Amy immediately recognized the expression on the woman's face. It was the polite curiosity of someone expecting a neighbor, not a delivery. "Good afternoon," the woman said with an easy smile. "Can I help you?" Amy held the bouquet carefully in front of her. "Are you Eleanor Brooks?" The woman nodded. "Yes, I am." Amy remembered the instructions perfectly. "These flowers are for you." Eleanor blinked in surprise and glanced at the arrangement. "There must be some mistake. I didn't order flowers." Amy hesitated for only a second before repeating the exact sentence written in the note. "They were ordered exactly 30 days ago." Silence settled between them. The cheerful smile slowly disappeared from Eleanor's face. Her eyes fixed on the 7 white roses, then the blue irises, then finally the sunflower that leaned gently toward the western sky. The color drained from her cheeks. For several long seconds she did not speak. Instead, she whispered something so quietly that Amy could not hear it. "Is everything all right?" Amy asked softly. Eleanor looked up, and although she seemed shaken, there was no fear in her expression. There was recognition. The kind of recognition reserved for memories buried so deeply that they feel almost unreal when they return. Without another word, she accepted the bouquet with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against the rosemary. A faint smile appeared, though it was touched with sadness. "Would you?" Eleanor paused before continuing. "Would you mind coming inside for just a minute?" Amy knew she still had deliveries waiting, yet curiosity had already carried her much farther than professionalism. "Of course," she replied. The house was bright and welcoming. Family photographs covered the hallway walls. Some showed Eleanor as a young woman standing beside a handsome man with dark hair and kind eyes. Others featured children, grandchildren, birthdays, graduations, and vacations at the seaside. Everything about the home suggested an ordinary, happy life. Eleanor placed the bouquet gently on the dining table as though it were something fragile beyond flowers themselves. She stared at it for several moments before walking to a cabinet and removing a small wooden box polished smooth by time. She unlocked it with a tiny brass key she wore on a chain around her neck. Inside were old letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Several black and white photographs, and a pressed sunflower whose petals had become almost golden brown with age. Eleanor carefully unfolded one yellowed letter and handed it to Amy. "Read the last paragraph," she said. Amy hesitated. "I'm not sure I should." "Please." The handwriting looked remarkably similar to the elegant script from the mysterious envelopes. She read silently. "If life surprises us and we are separated for longer than either of us expects, I promise I will still keep my word. Someday, even if many years pass, you will receive 7 white roses, 4 blue irises, 3 sprigs of rosemary, and 1 sunflower facing west. When that day comes, smile instead of crying. Because it will mean promises can travel farther than people ever can." Amy looked up slowly. "Who wrote this?" Eleanor smiled gently while running her fingers across the faded paper. "My fiancé, Thomas." She pointed toward one of the photographs hanging above the fireplace. The same dark-haired young man stood beside her, both of them laughing into the camera as though the future belonged entirely to them. "We planned to marry when we were 26. Amy waited quietly. "But life changed." Eleanor nodded. "It did. We lost touch under circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. Years passed. I eventually married someone else, raised a family, built a wonderful life. And assumed Thomas had done the same somewhere far away. I never saw him again." Amy glanced back at the bouquet. "Then who ordered these flowers?" Eleanor looked toward the window where the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent into the west. "That," she said almost to herself, "is the question I've been asking ever since you rang the bell." Neither woman noticed the small folded card that had slipped unnoticed from between the white roses onto the polished wooden floor. It remained there silently beneath the table, waiting to be discovered. Neither Amy nor Eleanor noticed the small folded card until nearly 20 minutes later, when Amy bent down to retrieve a fallen rosemary leaf from the polished wooden floor. The cream-colored card lay half-hidden beneath the dining table, its edge just visible beneath the shadow cast by the bouquet. It matched the envelopes perfectly. Amy reached for it carefully and looked at Eleanor, who seemed equally surprised. "Was this inside the flowers?" Amy asked. Eleanor slowly nodded. "It wasn't there when I took them from you." Amy unfolded the card. There were only 2 handwritten sentences. "Open the blue box in the attic. Do not wait until tomorrow." There was no signature. No explanation. Eleanor stared at the words as though they had reached across decades to find her. There is a blue box, she whispered. I haven't thought about it in years. Amy looked up. You know what this means? Eleanor gave a slow, uncertain nod. When my husband and I moved into this house nearly 35 years ago, I packed away everything that reminded me of my life before I met him. Not because I wanted to erase it, but because I believed some memories should be allowed to rest. I remember placing an old blue storage box in the attic. I haven't opened it since. Amy noticed that Eleanor's voice carried no guilt, only nostalgia. She had clearly loved her husband, whose framed photograph rested proudly on the mantelpiece surrounded by family pictures. Whatever Thomas had once meant to her belonged to another chapter of her life. Would you like me to help you? Amy asked. Eleanor smiled gratefully. I'd appreciate that very much. The attic staircase creaked beneath their weight as they climbed into the dusty space above the house. Afternoon sunlight slipped through a small circular window, filling the room with floating particles of dust that shimmered in the air. Old furniture stood beneath white sheets. Boxes labeled Christmas, kitchen, and children's school projects lined one wall. Near the far corner rested a faded blue trunk. Exactly as the note had described. Eleanor stood still for a moment before walking toward it. I honestly forgot this was even here, she admitted. The metal latch resisted slightly before finally clicking open. Inside were neatly folded scarves, several old notebooks, theater tickets, postcards from cities she had visited in her 20s, and dozens of letters tied together with the same faded blue ribbon Amy had seen downstairs. Beneath everything else lay a small leather journal. Eleanor frowned. I don't remember this. She lifted it gently and opened the cover. On the first page, written in the same elegant handwriting that appeared in the mysterious order, were 4 simple words. For when you smile. Eleanor's eyes widened. This is Thomas's handwriting. Amy stepped closer. The journal was not a diary. Each page contained a short message dated many years apart, almost as if someone had written to the future instead of the present. The earliest entries described ordinary moments. A walk beside a river. A conversation about books. A picnic ruined by unexpected rain that somehow became their favorite memory. As Eleanor turned each page, she occasionally laughed through tears, remembering details she had believed were lost forever. Then the entries changed. The final pages had no dates at all. Instead, they contained observations that felt strangely timeless. If this journal ever reaches you, then something unexpected has happened. If someone delivers flowers exactly as promised, trust them. The last page is not for you. Please give it to the florist. Amy looked at Eleanor. Neither of them spoke. Eleanor slowly turned to the final page. It had been folded inward separately from the rest of the journal. She unfolded it with trembling hands. Written across the page were only 3 lines. Dear Florist. Thank you for keeping a promise that was never truly yours. Now please visit the old bookstore next door to your shop tomorrow morning before you unlock your own door. Someone has been waiting much longer than you realize. Amy felt a chill travel through her arms despite the warmth of the attic. She looked at Eleanor in disbelief. How could he possibly know where my flower shop is? Eleanor closed the journal just as gently as she had opened it. I don't know, she replied quietly. But I have a feeling this story isn't really about Thomas. Or about me. Outside the attic window, the setting sun illuminated the western sky with deep shades of gold, and for reasons neither woman could explain, the sunflower downstairs had turned just enough to face the light perfectly. Amy hardly slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the elegant handwriting, the strange precision of the flower order, and the final message waiting inside Thomas's journal. Logic offered no satisfying explanation. Perhaps someone had researched the flower shop after writing the journal. Perhaps Eleanor had unknowingly forgotten important details. Perhaps the mysterious customer had simply orchestrated an elaborate surprise. Yet none of those possibilities explained how a journal that had remained unopened in an attic for more than 3 decades could contain instructions mentioning the bookstore that stood beside Amy's flower shop today. Buildings changed owners. Businesses closed. Streets evolved. Whoever had written the message seemed to have known exactly where Amy would be on this particular morning. She arrived on Hawthorne Street nearly an hour earlier than usual. Dawn painted the sky with pale shades of silver, and the neighborhood remained unusually quiet. The bakery lights were already glowing, but the flower shop was still dark. Amy did not unlock her own door. Instead, she crossed the narrow sidewalk toward the old bookstore that had been her neighbor for as long as she could remember. She had visited it only a handful of times over the years, usually to buy gardening books or greeting cards. The elderly owner, Mr. Leonard Wells, was already inside, carefully arranging books in the front display window. When he noticed Amy standing outside so early, he smiled and unlocked the door before the official opening time. "You're earlier than the sparrows today," he joked warmly. Amy smiled, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. "I'm sorry to bother you before opening." "Not at all. Come in." The familiar scent of old paper and polished wood filled the small shop. Every shelf seemed to lean slightly beneath the weight of decades of stories. Sunlight filtered through the dusty front windows, illuminating tiny floating particles that drifted lazily through the air. Mr. Wells poured 2 cups of tea without asking. As though early morning conversations naturally required them. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Amy hesitated. The entire story sounded impossible when spoken aloud, but she told him everything anyway. The mysterious customer. The bouquet. Eleanor Brooks. Thomas's journal. The final instruction leading her here. Mr. Wells listened without interrupting. He did not laugh. He did not question her sanity. Instead, he quietly set down his teacup and stared toward one of the highest shelves in the store. "I wondered if this day would ever come," he said at last. Amy frowned. "What do you mean?" Without answering immediately, Mr. Wells walked toward the back of the shop. After a minute he returned carrying a small wooden drawer that looked as though it had once belonged inside an old card catalog. He placed it gently on the counter and unlocked it with a brass key hanging from his watch chain. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope. Amy's breath caught. It was identical to the others. Even before touching it, she recognized the thick paper and careful handwriting. Her own name appeared neatly across the front. "Who left this?" she asked. "Mr. Wells smiled faintly. A gentleman came into the shop 27 years ago. He was polite, well-dressed, and carried several envelopes exactly like that one. He told me I would know when to hand it over. Amy stared at him in disbelief. 27 years ago? Yes. Did he tell you his name? Mr. Wells nodded slowly. Thomas Bennett. Amy felt the room become strangely still. That's impossible. Perhaps, Mr. Wells replied. At the time, he also asked me one unusual question. What question? Mr. Wells looked directly into her eyes. He asked whether the flower shop next door still belonged to the White family. Amy froze. Very few people knew that before she owned the business, it had belonged to her mother, and before that to her grandmother. The shop had remained in her family for nearly 70 years. Mr. Wells continued quietly. When I told him yes. He smiled and said, then everything is happening exactly as it should. Amy carefully picked up the envelope. The paper felt warm despite having been stored in the drawer for decades. For a long moment she simply held it, uncertain whether she truly wanted to know what came next. Finally, she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet and an old black and white photograph. The photograph showed a young Thomas standing beside another person whose face had been partly hidden by sunlight. Only one detail remained unmistakably clear. The second person was holding a bouquet of 7 white roses, 4 blue irises, 3 sprigs of rosemary, and 1 sunflower facing west. Amy unfolded the letter. The first line made her heart race. If you are reading this, then you have finally become the florist I hoped you would be. Amy read the first sentence again, hoping she had misunderstood it, but the words remained exactly the same. If you are reading this, then you have finally become the florist I hoped you would be. She lowered the page and looked at Mr. Wells, who merely shrugged. I never opened it, he said quietly. He made me promise. Amy took a slow breath and continued reading. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. Every line flowed with the same calm elegance she had seen in Eleanor's letters and journal. You are probably trying to understand how I could know your profession before meeting you. The truth is much less mysterious than you imagine. I did not know you. I only trusted that some promises, when cared for properly, find the right hands. Flowers have always traveled farther than people. Florists understand this better than anyone. They carry messages without asking unnecessary questions. That is why this letter was left with the bookstore instead of the flower shop. Bookstores preserve stories. Flower shops deliver them. Amy paused. Something about the words felt less like an explanation and more like a conversation reaching across many years. She continued. You have already met Eleanor. If she smiled when she received the bouquet, then everything important has already happened. Nothing more is required of her. The next part concerns only you. Amy exchanged another glance with Mr. Wells before reading further. One day you will wonder whether coincidence truly exists. I cannot answer that question for you. What I can tell you is this. 30 years ago I entered your family's flower shop intending to place my unusual order. The person behind the counter was not you. It was your mother. Amy's fingers tightened around the paper. She had been only a child 30 years earlier. Her mother had owned the shop then, just as Mr. Wells had said. Thomas's letter continued. Your mother listened patiently while I described the bouquet. When I finished, she smiled kindly and told me something I have never forgotten. She said, flowers never arrive too late. They arrive exactly when someone is ready to receive them. I realized then that my order was not ready. Neither was Eleanor. So I left without placing it. Amy closed her eyes for a moment. Those words sounded exactly like something her mother would have said. She had often repeated similar thoughts while teaching Amy how to arrange bouquets. The letter continued. Years passed. I often wondered whether I should return, but life has a habit of changing our plans. Before I had another opportunity, I became seriously ill. That is when I decided to leave instructions instead of expectations. I prepared letters, journals, envelopes. I asked strangers to keep small promises for someone they would never meet. I trusted that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary kindness when given a simple task. Amy read more slowly now. The mystery she had imagined was beginning to transform into something else entirely. You may think I carefully predicted the future. I did not. I simply believed in people. I believed Mr. Wells would keep an envelope safe because he loved books. I believed a florist would eventually honor an unusual order because flowers matter to those who arrange them. I believed Eleanor would still recognize our bouquet because memories fade more slowly than we fear. Amy felt a lump form in her throat. The explanation was remarkably simple, yet one question remained unanswered. She turned to the final page. There, beneath the closing paragraph, Thomas had written one last confession. There is only one thing I could never arrange myself. I never learned whether Eleanor found happiness. If she smiled today, then please consider this letter answered. That single smile is all I ever hoped to receive, even though I would never be there to see it. Amy lowered the paper in silence. The bookstore seemed quieter than before. Outside, the first customers had begun walking along Hawthorne Street, unaware that inside the little shop an old promise had finally reached its destination. Mr. Wells broke the silence gently. Did he solve the mystery? Amy smiled faintly. Part of it. She looked again at the photograph. The face beside Thomas was still hidden by the bright sunlight reflecting into the camera. Until that moment she had assumed the missing person had simply been someone standing beside him by chance. Now she noticed something she had overlooked before. The hidden figure was wearing a florist's apron embroidered with a small flower stitched above the pocket. Amy's family flower shop had used that exact design for decades. Her smile slowly faded. Thomas had written that he never managed to place the order with her mother. Yet somehow, long before anyone else became involved, he possessed a photograph of himself standing beside someone wearing the White family's florist apron while holding the very bouquet that would not be assembled until 30 years later. The letter had explained almost everything. But that photograph had quietly created an entirely new mystery. Amy carried the photograph back to her flower shop, placing it carefully on the work table where she usually arranged wedding bouquets. The morning customers came and went, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the faded black and white image. The hidden figure occupied nearly half the photograph, yet a burst of sunlight reflecting into the old camera lens concealed the person's face completely. Everything else, however, remained surprisingly sharp. The apron. The bouquet. Thomas's relaxed smile. Even the small embroidered flower above the pocket was perfectly visible. Richard noticed the photograph while unpacking fresh lilies. "Is that the one from the bookstore?" he asked. Amy nodded. He studied it for several moments before saying quietly, "The apron really does look like yours." Amy walked into the storage room and returned carrying an old cardboard box labeled Shop History. Her mother had kept nearly everything: handwritten receipts, faded business cards, newspaper advertisements, photographs of floral displays, and even old uniforms that employees had worn decades earlier. After a few minutes of searching, Amy unfolded one carefully preserved apron. She laid it beside the photograph. Richard compared them without speaking. The stitching matched exactly. Even the tiny imperfection in one embroidered leaf appeared identical. "That's not similar," he finally said. "That's the same design." Amy nodded slowly. "My grandmother embroidered every apron herself. She never made two exactly alike." The realization deepened the mystery. Somehow, the apron in the photograph had belonged to someone connected directly to her family's shop. Yet Thomas's own letter insisted that he had left without placing the order. During lunch, Amy called her mother, Margaret White, who had retired several years earlier to a quiet cottage outside the city. Margaret answered cheerfully, delighted to hear from her daughter. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, Amy carefully described everything that had happened over the past 2 days. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Thomas Bennett," she repeated thoughtfully. "The name sounds familiar." Amy sat upright. "You remember him?" "Not clearly. Give me a little time." Amy waited while she heard drawers opening and papers being moved. Her mother had always organized memories the same way she organized flowers, with remarkable patience. Several minutes later Margaret returned to the phone. "I found one of my appointment books from that year." Amy held her breath. "Is his name in it?" "No. That's the strange part." Margaret paused. "There's no order under his name, but on one page I wrote something unusual." She slowly read the faded note aloud. "Kind gentleman visited. Asked impossible question. Left smiling. Said he already had what he came for." Amy looked down at the photograph lying on the table. "Did he buy anything?" "Apparently not." Margaret hesitated. "But I also wrote something else." "What?" "Asked whether photographs can remember people better than people remember photographs." Richard looked up from across the room, clearly having overheard the sentence. Neither he nor Amy spoke. Margaret continued. "I always assumed he was a poet or a writer. He was polite, thanked me for my time, and left. I never saw him again." Amy thanked her mother and ended the call. But the notebook entry lingered in her mind. He already had what he came for. That afternoon she examined the old photograph under a magnifying glass normally used for reading tiny plant labels. Near the lower right corner she noticed something she had missed before. A date had been lightly embossed into the paper by the camera manufacturer. It was genuine, not handwritten. The photograph had unquestionably been developed 31 years earlier. There was no possibility that it had been created recently. She turned it over. On the back, written in faint pencil almost erased by time, was a single sentence. Some faces are hidden until the story is finished. Amy read the words twice before carefully placing the photograph back on the table. She suddenly understood why the face had been concealed. Whoever had arranged all of this had never intended the mystery to be solved piece by piece. Every answer seemed designed to arrive only after the previous one had been accepted. As the shop prepared to close for the evening, the bell above the entrance rang once more. Amy looked up automatically, expecting a last-minute customer searching for anniversary flowers. Instead, an elderly woman she had never met stepped quietly inside. She carried no handbag, no flowers, and no shopping list. Her eyes rested immediately on the photograph lying on the counter. A warm smile spread across her face. "I wondered when that picture would finally reach you," she said softly. Amy blinked in surprise. "You've seen it before?" The woman nodded. "Many years ago." She stepped closer, looked at the hidden face in the photograph, and added with complete confidence, "If you're ready, I can tell you why no one was ever supposed to recognize the person standing beside Thomas, at least not until now." The elderly woman introduced herself as Clara Morton before Amy could ask another question. Her voice was calm and steady, carrying the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting a secret rather than inventing one. She appeared to be in her late 70s, dressed in a simple navy coat despite the pleasant weather outside. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance except for the way she looked at the photograph. She did not study it with curiosity. She looked at it with recognition, as though greeting an old friend after many years apart. Amy invited her to sit near the front window while Richard quietly turned the sign on the door to closed. Neither of them wanted interruptions. Clara folded her hands on the small wooden table and smiled gently. "Thomas once told me that stories should never be explained too early," she said. "If they are, people stop listening before they begin understanding." Amy carefully placed the photograph between them. "Did you know Thomas?" Clara nodded. "For nearly 20 years. We worked together at the public library before I retired. He was not a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. He preferred arranging small acts of kindness that nobody could trace back to him." Amy leaned forward. "Then why all the letters? The envelopes? The impossible instructions?" Clara laughed softly. "Because Thomas loved unfinished promises. He believed the world already contained enough broken ones. Whenever he made a promise, he wanted it to survive even if he did not." She paused for a moment before continuing. "When he realized he was seriously ill, he began preparing what he called his chain of kindness. He left dozens of sealed envelopes with people he trusted. A librarian. A bookseller. A music teacher. A retired postman. Even the owner of a small clock repair shop. Each person received only one instruction: Keep this safe until someone asks the right question or arrives at the right moment. Amy exchanged a surprised glance with Richard. There were dozens of envelopes. At least 40 that I know of. Clara replied. Most contain simple requests. Deliver a letter. Return a borrowed book. Give someone an old photograph. Send a birthday card years later. None of us knew how the pieces connected. Thomas insisted that we should never compare notes. Amy felt a growing admiration for the man she had never met. What had first seemed mysterious was beginning to resemble an extraordinary exercise in trust. Thomas had depended entirely on ordinary strangers keeping simple promises for decades. Clara reached into her handbag and removed a thin notebook bound in green cloth. The cover had faded with age. This was mine, she explained. Thomas asked me to keep it until I heard that Eleanor Brooks had received flowers containing rosemary. Amy smiled faintly. That happened yesterday. Then my task is finally complete. She handed the notebook across the table. Inside were only a few pages of writing. Most described ordinary conversations between Clara and Thomas during their years at the library. Then, near the end, Amy found another familiar sentence written in Thomas's elegant handwriting. If you are reading this, then the photograph has probably caused unnecessary confusion. Fortunately, confusion has a wonderful habit of making people pay closer attention. Amy continued reading. People always assume the hidden face belongs to someone important. In truth, the hidden face could belong to almost anyone. That is precisely the point. Amy frowned. She turned the page. When photographers accidentally overexposed old film, faces sometimes disappeared while everything around them remained visible. I loved that accident. It reminded me that we often remember actions more clearly than appearances. Years from now, nobody will remember exactly who handed over a bouquet, who carried a letter, or who kept an envelope safe inside a drawer. They will remember only that someone did. Amy slowly lowered the notebook. Clara smiled. He showed me that photograph once. I asked whether he was disappointed that the face had been ruined by sunlight. What did he say? Amy asked. Clara's eyes sparkled with the memory. He said, no. Now anyone can stand there. Silence settled over the flower shop. Amy looked again at the hidden figure. For days she had tried to discover the person's identity. Now she realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. The concealed face was never meant to identify one individual. It represented every ordinary person who had quietly carried Thomas's promises across the years without expecting recognition. The florist. The bookseller. The librarian. The neighbors. Even Amy herself. Richard finally broke the silence. So there isn't one missing person? Clara gently shook her head. There never was. She stood, buttoned her coat, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back one final time. Thomas once told me that the greatest surprise in any story should not be magic. It should be discovering how much good people are willing to do for someone they may never meet. She smiled warmly at Amy. There's just one final envelope left. And unlike all the others, that one wasn't written by Thomas. With that, Clara stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, leaving Amy and Richard staring at one another. On the table, tucked inside the last page of the green notebook, rested a fresh cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in handwriting that was unmistakably different from Thomas's elegant script, were 5 simple words, "For the next flower shop owner." Amy stared at the envelope for several long moments without touching it. Unlike every previous letter, this one did not seem aged by decades. The paper was crisp. The folds were sharp. The ink had barely faded. Most striking of all was the handwriting. Thomas's script had always flowed with graceful confidence, each letter connected to the next as though the words themselves were taking a leisurely walk. This writing was different. Simpler. More direct. Yet there was something familiar about it that Amy could not immediately identify. Richard picked up the green notebook and leafed through it once more, searching for another clue, but Clara had already shared everything it contained. The shop was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator keeping the flowers fresh. Outside, the evening sun cast long golden reflections across Hawthorne Street. Amy finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key attached with blue thread. The letter began without a greeting. "If you have opened this envelope, then you already understand something that took me many years to learn. A flower shop is not merely a place that sells flowers. It is a place where invisible connections become visible for a little while. People arrive carrying emotions they cannot quite express. They leave carrying flowers that somehow manage to speak for them." Amy smiled softly. Those words felt strangely close to her own beliefs. She continued reading. "This letter is not asking you to continue Thomas's work. No one could. It is asking you to continue your own." She turned the page. "The brass key opens the small drawer beneath your front counter. You may not even know that the drawer exists. Most owners never notice it because it was designed to blend into the wood. Someone will eventually stand where you once stood, wondering whether to take responsibility for a stranger's unusual request. When that day comes, leave this envelope for them instead of explaining everything yourself. Every generation deserves the chance to discover that kindness can travel farther than instructions." Amy frowned. Beneath the front counter. She had owned the shop for 12 years and had repaired nearly every shelf and cabinet herself. She was certain there was no hidden drawer. Curious, she knelt beside the old oak counter and ran her fingers underneath its edge. At first she found nothing except smooth wood polished by countless years of use. Then her fingertips brushed against a tiny circular indentation no larger than a coin. She inserted the brass key. With a soft click, a narrow drawer slid open almost silently. Richard stared in disbelief. "How long has that been there?" Amy laughed quietly. "Apparently longer than I've been alive." Inside the drawer rested only 3 objects. The first was a faded photograph of the flower shop taken many decades earlier. The second was a notebook containing handwritten observations about flowers, customers, and memorable deliveries, each entry written by a different person over the course of many years. Some pages belonged to Amy's grandmother. Others were written by her mother. Near the end were blank pages waiting for future owners. The third object was another envelope, identical to the one Amy had just opened. It was completely empty. Richard looked puzzled. Why leave an empty envelope? Amy read the final paragraph of the letter. The empty envelope matters more than any letter it might one day contain. It is a reminder that every generation receives opportunities to begin a story rather than merely finish one. Do not decide today what should eventually be placed inside. Life will write that part for you. Amy carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. For the first time since the mysterious customer had entered the shop, she felt no urgency to solve another puzzle. Instead, she experienced a quiet sense of gratitude. The mystery had never been about secret codes, impossible predictions, or unexplained events. It had been about trust passed patiently from one ordinary person to another until, decades later, a single bouquet completed a promise that had refused to disappear. As she closed the hidden drawer, she suddenly recognized the handwriting on the final envelope. It was not Thomas's. It was not Clara's. It belonged to her mother, Margaret. Amy called her immediately. When Margaret answered, Amy asked only one question. "Did you write the last letter?" There was a gentle laugh on the other end of the line. "Yes," her mother replied. "Thomas asked me one favor before he left the shop all those years ago. He said that someday our family would understand why flower shops should never stop believing in impossible orders." Amy smiled through unexpected tears. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Margaret answered with the same calm certainty she had always carried. "Because it was never my story to reveal. It was yours to discover." Amy looked around the little shop that had belonged to 3 generations of her family. The flowers seemed exactly as they had every other evening, yet somehow they looked different now. Not because they had changed, but because she finally understood what her mother had been protecting all those years. Some bouquets were arranged with stems, petals, and ribbon. Others were arranged with patience, trust, and time. And, on very rare occasions, they bloomed decades after the first flower had been chosen. The following Monday began like every other. Amy unlocked the faded green door, carried fresh buckets of flowers onto the sidewalk, watered the hanging baskets, and turned the wooden sign from closed to open. Morning sunlight spilled across Hawthorne Street, illuminating the bookstore next door and the bakery beyond it. Customers soon arrived with familiar requests. A young man wanted roses for an apology. A grandmother chose bright tulips for her granddaughter's first recital. A little girl carefully counted coins to buy a single daisy for her teacher. Amy arranged every bouquet with the same attention she always had, but something inside her had changed. She no longer believed that flowers simply marked important moments. Sometimes they quietly created them. Throughout the week, she filled several pages in the notebook hidden beneath the counter. Unlike the earlier entries, she did not write about unusual mysteries. Instead, she recorded small acts of kindness that most people would probably forget. The customer who secretly paid for another person's bouquet. The elderly neighbor who brought homemade soup to someone recovering from surgery. The child who insisted on choosing the brightest sunflower because, in her words, everyone deserves one sunny thing. Amy realized that Thomas had understood something remarkable. Extraordinary stories were rarely built from extraordinary people. They were built from ordinary people making gentle decisions again and again until those decisions formed a life worth remembering. A month later, Eleanor Brooks returned to the flower shop carrying a homemade apple pie. She looked lighter than she had on the day of the mysterious delivery. Her smile came easily now. She thanked Amy once again, but this time not only for the bouquet. "I spent years believing I had forgotten an important part of my youth," she admitted. "Then I realized I hadn't forgotten it at all. I had simply placed it where it belonged, with gratitude instead of regret." She handed Amy a small framed photograph. It was the same picture of Thomas, but this copy had been taken from a different print preserved among Eleanor's belongings. The sunlight still washed over part of the image. Yet the hidden figure was a little clearer. Amy smiled as soon as she saw it. The face remained impossible to identify. It could have been almost anyone. Somehow that felt exactly right. She placed the photograph on a shelf behind the counter, where customers occasionally admired it without asking many questions. When they did ask, Amy simply smiled and said, "It's a reminder that every meaningful story involves people whose names we may never know." Years passed. Richard eventually opened a flower shop of his own in another town, inspired by everything he had witnessed. Eleanor celebrated her 80th birthday surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends, with a sunflower always standing proudly in the center of the table. Mr. Wells finally retired from the bookstore, leaving it to a young woman who loved novels as much as he did. Before handing over the keys, he quietly entrusted her with one cream-colored envelope. He offered no explanation beyond a single sentence. "You'll know when it matters." She accepted it without hesitation. Amy herself grew older, just as her mother and grandmother had before her. One autumn afternoon, after decades of arranging countless bouquets, she welcomed a new apprentice into the shop. The young florist was curious, patient, and treated every flower as though it deserved individual attention. Amy watched her work for several months before opening the hidden drawer beneath the counter. The notebook was nearly full now. The empty envelope was no longer empty. Over the years, Amy had written a letter of her own, not about Thomas, nor about Eleanor, nor about mysterious orders, but about the quiet responsibility of carrying hope from one stranger to another. She placed the letter inside the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and locked it with the little brass key. She never mentioned it to her apprentice. She understood now that some discoveries lose their meaning if they are explained too soon. On her final day before retirement, Amy stood alone in the shop for a few peaceful minutes. The familiar scent of roses, eucalyptus, and fresh greenery filled the air. She looked around at the place that had shaped 3 generations of her family and smiled. The mystery that had once consumed her no longer felt mysterious. Its greatest surprise had never been hidden envelopes, forgotten journals, or impossible timing. The true surprise was that a single act of kindness, performed without expectation of recognition, could continue changing lives long after the person who began it was gone. As she switched the sign from open to closed for the last time, the bell above the entrance chimed unexpectedly. Amy turned toward the door. A young customer stepped inside, holding a cream-colored envelope. "I'm sorry," the visitor said with an embarrassed smile. "I know this may sound like a very unusual request, but I'd like to order a rather specific bouquet." Amy smiled with quiet understanding. "Of course," she replied. "Please, tell me everything." And somewhere, In the invisible space where promises patiently wait for their proper moment, another story gently began.